By the way, what do you intend doing now? Well, I'm going to look for insects, but the last bus back has already gone. Isn't there any place I can stay here? Stay all night? In this village? The man's face twitched. If I can't stay here, I'll walk on to the next village. Walk? As a matter of fact, I'm in no special hurry. Well, why go to all that trouble? He suddenly became loquacious. You can see this is a poor village, he said in an accommodating tone. There isn't a decent house in it. But if it's all right with you, I'll put in a good word and see what I can do to help you out. He did not seem to bear any ill will. They were just being cautious. Perhaps on the lookout for some prefectural official who was scheduled to come on a tour of inspection. With their sense of caution appeased, they were merely good, simple fisher folk. I should be very grateful if you would. Of course, I will expect to show my appreciation. I am particularly fond of staying in village houses. The sun had set, and the wind had slackened somewhat. He walked along the dunes until he could no longer distinguish the pattern hewn by the wind in the sand. There seemed to be nothing that faintly resembled crops. Orthopetra, small winged crickets and white whiskered earwigs, rhinocoda, red striped soldier bugs. He was not certain of the name, but surely it was a type of soldier bug. Of the sheath-winged insects which he sought, white-backed billbugs and long-legged letter-droppers, he had not been able to spot a single one of the beetle family that was his real aim, and indeed, for that very reason, he was anticipating the fruits of the next day's battle. His fatigue brought faint spots of light dancing on his retina. Then, in spite of himself, he stopped walking and fixed his eyes on the surface of the darkening dunes. It was no use. Anything that moved looked like a beetle. As he promised, the old man was waiting for him in the front of the cooperative offices. I'm sorry for all this trouble. Not at all. I only hope you'll like what I found for you. A meeting seemed to be in session in the offices. 4 or 5 men were sitting in a circle from which shouts of laughter rose. On the front of the entry hung a horizontal plaque with large lettering. Love your home. The old man said something. Abruptly, the laughing stopped, and he walked out leading the others. The shell-strewn road floated vague and white in the twilight. He was escorted to one of the cavities on the ridge of the dunes at one end of the village. From the ridge, a narrow path went down the slope to the right. After they had walked on a while, the old man leaned over into the darkness and, clapping his hands, shouted in a loud voice, "Hey, Granny! Hey there!" From the depths of the darkness, at their feet, a lamp flickered, and there was an answer. "Here I am, here. There's a ladder over by the sandbags." Indeed, without the ladder, he could not possibly have got down. He would have had to catch hold on the cliff with his bare hands. It was almost 3 times the height of the house top, and even with the ladder, it was still not easy to manage. In the daytime, he recalled, the slope had seemed to him rather gentle, but as he looked at it now, it was close to perpendicular. The ladder was an uncertain thing of rope, and if one lost one's balance, it would get hopelessly tangled up. It was quite like living in a natural stronghold. You needn't worry about anything. Have a good rest. The old man turned around and went back, without going all the way to the bottom. Sand poured down from the overhead. The man had a feeling of curiosity, as if he had returned to his childhood. He wondered whether the woman was old. She had been called Granny, but the person who came to meet him, holding up a lamp, was a smallish, nice sort of woman, around 30. Perhaps she was wearing powder. For someone who lived by the sea, she was amazingly white. Anyway, he was extremely grateful for her cheerful welcome, from which she could not conceal her own pleasure. Indeed, if it had not been for the warm reception, the house itself would have been difficult to put up with at all. He would have had thought they were making a fool of him, and would doubtless have gone back at once. The walls were peeling, matting had been hung up in place of sliding doors, the upright supports were warped, boards had replaced all the windows, the straw mats were on the point of rotting, and when one walked on them they made a noise like a wet sponge. Moreover, an offensive smell of burned, mouldering sand floated over the whole place. Well, everything depended on one's attitude. He was disarmed by the woman's manner. He told himself that this one night was a rare experience, and, if he were lucky, he might run up against some interesting insects. It was certainly an environment in which insects would gladly live. His premonition was right. No sooner had he taken the seat offered him beside the hearth, which was sunk in the earthen floor, than all around there was the sound of what seemed to be the pitter-patter of rain. It was an army of fleas, but he was not one to be overwhelmed by such things. An insect collector is always prepared. He had dusted the inside of his clothing with DDT, and it would be wise, before he went to sleep, to dab some insecticide on the exposed parts of his body. "I'm just fixing something to eat. If you'll just wait a few minutes more," the woman said, half standing and taking the lamp. "Can you get along without the light for a moment, please?" "Do you only have one lamp?" "I'm sorry. Yes." She laughed, a little embarrassed. On her left cheek, a dimple appeared. Apart from her eyes, she had undeniable charm, he thought. Perhaps the look in her eyes was the result of some affliction. No matter how much makeup she used, she could not conceal the inflamed corners. Before going to bed, he decided he would, without fail, apply some eye medicine too. It doesn't make any difference, but first I would rather like a bath. A bath? Don't you have one? I'm terribly sorry, but could you put it off until the day after tomorrow? The day after tomorrow? But I won't be here the day after tomorrow. In spite of himself, he laughed out loud. Oh? She turned her face away with a drawn-up expression. She was disappointed. He supposed, and of course with country folk there is no attempt at pretense. He ran his tongue several times over his lips with the feeling of embarrassment. "If you don't have a bath, some water that I could pour over me would do just fine. My whole body's covered with sand." "I'm sorry, but we don't have more than a bucketful of water either. The well is pretty far away." She looked quite abashed, and he decided to say no more. He was soon to realize, unpleasantly, the uselessness of bathing. The woman brought in the meal. Clam soup with boiled fish. Very much a shore meal, it seemed. That was all right. But as he began to eat, she opened a large paper umbrella and put it over him. What's that thing for? He wondered, if it were some kind of custom of the region. "Well, if I don't put this up, the sand will get in your food." "How is that?" he said, looking up in surprise at the ceiling, where, however, there were no holes at all. She followed his eyes to the ceiling. The sand sifts in everywhere. Almost an inch piles up if I don't sweep it up every day. Is the roof faulty? Yes, pretty much so. But even if the thatching was brand new, the sand would sift in anyway. It's really terrible. It's worse than a wood borer. A wood borer? An insect that eats holes in the wood? That's probably a termite, isn't it? No, no. It's about this big, with a hard skin. Ah, well, it's a longhorn saw beetle then. A saw beetle? Long whiskers and reddish, isn't it? No, it's sort of bronze colored and shaped like a grain of rice. I see. Then it's an iridescent beetle. If you let it go on, beams like these rot away to nothing, you know? You mean the iridescent beetle? No, the sand. Why? It gets in from everywhere. On days when the wind direction is bad, it gets up under the roof, and if I didn't sweep it away, it would soon pile up so heavy that the ceiling boards wouldn't hold it. Yes, I can see why it wouldn't do to let the sand accumulate in the ceiling, but isn't it funny to say that it rots the beams? No, they do rot, but sand is essentially dry, you know? Anyway, it rots them. If you leave sand on brand new wooden clogs, they fall apart in half a month. They're just dissolved, they say, so it must be true. I don't understand the reason. Wood rots, and the sand rots with it. I even heard that soil rich enough to grow cucumbers came out of the roof boards of a house that had been buried under the sand. Impossible! He exclaimed rudely, making a wry face. He felt that his own personal concept of sand had been defiled by her ignorance. I know a little bit about sand myself. Let me tell you, sand moves around like this all year long. Its flow is its life. It absolutely never stops, anywhere. Whether in water or air, it moves about free and unrestricted. So, usually, ordinary living things are unable to endure life in it, and this goes for bacteria too. How shall I put it? Sand represents purity, cleanliness. Maybe it serves a preservative function, but there is certainly no question of its rotting anything. And what's more, dear lady, to begin with, sand is a respectable mineral. It couldn't possibly rot away. She stiffened and fell silent. Under the protection of the umbrella, which she was holding, the man, as if hurried, finished eating without a word. On the surface of the umbrella, so much sand had collected he could have written in it with his finger. And the damp was unbearable. The sand, of course, was not damp. It was his body that was damp. Above the roof the wind moaned. He drew out his cigarettes, and his pocket was full of sand. He had the feeling he could taste the bitterness even before he lit one. He took an insect out of the bottle of potassium cyanide. Before it stiffened, he fixed it with pins. At least he could preserve the shape of the legs. From the washstand outside came the sound of the woman cleaning dishes. Did no one else live in the house? He wondered. When she returned, she silently began to prepare the bed in a corner of the room. If she put his bed here, where in heaven's name did she intend to sleep? Naturally, in that inner room beyond the hanging mat. Besides these two, there didn't seem to be anything that faintly resembled the room, but it was a very strange way of doing things to put the guest in the room by the entry and let the hostess sleep in the inner one. Or did she have an invalid, unable to move, sleeping in the inner room? He wondered. Maybe. Certainly, it would be much more natural to assume so. In the first place, one could hardly expect a solitary woman to go to much trouble looking after passing travelers. Are there other people? What do you mean, other people? People in your family, or. No, I'm quite alone. The woman seemed to be aware of his thoughts and suddenly gave a forced and awkward laugh. Everything really gets so damp because of the sand, even the blankets. Well, what about your husband? Oh, yes. Last year in the typhoon, she said, busying herself unnecessarily with smoothing and patting down the edges of the matting which she had finished spreading out. Typhoons are terrible around here. The sand comes thundering down like a waterfall. 10 or 20 feet pile up in a night, no matter what you do. As much as 20 feet? At times like that, you can't ever catch up with the sand, no matter how much you shovel. He ran out with my little girl. She was in middle school then, yelling that the chicken houses were in danger. I was too busy taking care of the house and had to stay in. When morning finally came and the wind died down, I went out to look. There wasn't a trace of the chicken houses or anything else. Were they buried? Yes, completely. That was awful. Horrible. The sands are frightful. Suddenly, the lamp began to sputter. It's the sand. She got down on all fours and stretched out her arm. Laughing, she snapped the lamp wick with her finger. At once it burned brightly again. In the same posture, she gazed at the flame, smiling that unnatural smile. He realized that it was doubtless deliberately done to show off her dimple, and unconsciously his body stiffened. He thought it especially indecent of her, just after what she had been speaking of her loved one's death. Hey, there, we've brought a shovel and cans for the other one. A clear voice, considering that it came from a distance, broke the tension. Perhaps they were using a megaphone. And then came the sound of something like tin, containing striking against one another as they fell. The woman rose to answer. He had the exasperating feeling that something underhanded was going on. What's that? See, there's somebody else after all. Oh, for goodness' sake. She twisted her body as if she had been tickled. But somebody just said, for the other one. Well, they're referring to you. To me? Why mention me in connection with the shovel? Never mind. Don't pay attention. Really, they're so nosy. Was there some mistake? However, the woman didn't answer this, and swinging around on her knees, she stepped down on the earthen floor. Pardon me, but are you still using the lamp? Well, I haven't really finished with it. Why? Do you need it out there? No, this is work I'm used to. She put on a straw hat, of the kind used for gardening, and slipped out into the darkness. Bending his head to one side, the man lit another cigarette. There was something definitely suspicious, he felt. He arose quietly and decided to peek behind the suspended matting. There was indeed a room, but no bed. In its place, the sand had swept down in a gentle curve from beyond the wall. He shuddered involuntarily and stood rooted to the spot. This house was already half dead. Its insides were half eaten away by tentacles of ceaselessly flowing sand. Sand which didn't even have a form of its own, other than the mean 1/8 millimeter diameter. Yet not a single thing could stand against this shapeless, destructive power. The very fact that it had no form was doubtless the highest manifestation of its strength, was it not?